You know, they say grief comes in waves, hitting you when you least expect it, but nobody tells you that sometimes grief shows up wearing a beige power suit and holding a clipboard, standing in your driveway with a smile that could freeze hell over. I need you to picture this, because if I don't explain the visual, you won't understand the level of violation I walked into. I'm talking about a tree, a massive, sprawling white oak we called the Sentinel, planted in the Arizona dirt back in 1921 by my great-grandfather right after he came back from the Great War, a man who had seen enough trenches to know he needed to watch something beautiful grow for the rest of his life. That tree wasn't just wood and bark, it was the spinal cord of my family history, a living timeline where 4 generations of Thorns had taken their first steps, graduated, gotten married, and eventually said their goodbyes. I am Marcus Mac Thorn, a 52-year-old high-voltage lineman, living in the house my grandmother built, a craftsman gem that stood its ground while the cotton fields around us were sold off to developers who built Oakhaven Heights, a soulless labyrinth of stucco McMansions where uniformity is the religion and the homeowners association is the church. And the high priestess of this beige cult was Corinna Sterling. Corinna was a failed interior designer turned real estate shark who treated the HOA presidency like it was a seat on the UN Security Council, a woman who once measured my grass with a laser ruler because she felt 3/4 of an inch was anarchy, and who had been eyeing my tree like a butcher eyes a prime cut of beef for years. She claimed the branches of the Sentinel were an encroachment on communal airspace, a phrase so ridiculous it sounds like satire, but to her, it was gospel. The day everything broke was the day I buried my father, the old man. He had spent his final months sitting under that oak, letting the dappled sunlight wash over him while the cancer took the rest, finding peace in the rustle of leaves that he'd known since he was a boy. And when he passed, the house felt empty, like a lung with the air sucked out of it. I spent the morning at the cemetery, sweating in a wool suit that smelled like mothballs and sadness, listening to a pastor who didn't know Pops talk about a better place. While I just wanted to go home, sit under our tree, and drink a beer in silence. I pulled into the driveway at sunset, the golden hour, expecting peace, but instead, I heard the mechanical scream of a wood chipper. I stepped out of my truck, my legs feeling like lead, and my brain couldn't process the image in front of me. It was like looking at a glitch in reality, a violent, jagged wound in the sky. The Sentinel hadn't been removed, and it hadn't been trimmed. It had been vertically bisected, sheared straight down the middle from the crown to the trunk, leaving a grotesque, half-dead monolith standing there like a corpse propped up for display. It looked like someone had taken a giant sword and executed my family legacy, leaving the raw, bleeding heart of the wood exposed to the dry desert air. And there she was, Corinna Sterling, standing amidst a blizzard of fresh sawdust that coated her pristine blazer like snow, pointing at a crew of terrified-looking laborers with the manic energy of a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. She saw me, and she didn't look guilty. She didn't look remorseful. She looked satisfied, giving me this tight, triumphant smirk as she tapped her stylus against a tablet. "Emergency hazard abatement," she chirped, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. "We had reports of imminent structural failure, Mac. I had to act fast to protect the neighborhood children. I'm sure you understand." I stood there, still in my funeral black, staring at the sap bleeding from the fresh cut, realizing that while I was lowering my father into the ground, she was butchering his favorite spot in the world. "Who complained?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper because if I spoke any louder I was going to scream until my throat tore. "Show me the reports." "Privacy policy," she shot back, clutching that tablet like it held the nuclear codes. "But don't worry. The HOA has an emergency fund. Though we will be billing you for the overage, consider this a favor. That tree was an eyesore anyway." That was the moment. That was the split second where sadness hardened into something cold and sharp, something that felt a lot like a crowbar in the hand. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. I just walked inside my silent house, the smell of sawdust following me in, settling on my kitchen table, coating my father's empty chair. I sat in the dark for an hour, just vibrating with rage, until there was a knock at the back door. It was Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim is 83 years old, stands 4'0", and is the neighborhood's unofficial CIA operative, a woman who installed 4K security cameras not to catch burglars, but to catch the delivery guys mishandling her packages. She shuffled in, holding a USB drive like it was a holy relic, and she didn't say a word. She just plugged it into my laptop and hit play. The timestamp read 6:45 a.m., the morning of the funeral. There was Corinna, hours before any so-called emergency was declared, walking around my tree with a contractor, pointing, laughing, and shaking hands. There was no inspection, there was no structural assessment. There was just a deal being made in the quiet of the dawn while she knew I was at the funeral home. "She knew you were gone," Mrs. Kim whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and excitement. "She waited for the hearse to leave, Mac. She filed the emergency paperwork at noon, but the crew was already setting up at 9 a.m. You can't have an emergency response before the emergency is reported." I looked at the screen, watching Corinna hand an envelope of cash to the foreman, a guy who looked like he'd cut his own mother in half for a pack of cigarettes. "This wasn't maintenance," I said, realizing the scope of what I was looking at. This was a hit. I spent that night reading the HOA bylaws, fueled by grief and black coffee, and that's when I found the first crack in her armor, a tiny procedural footnote that said emergency powers required a 72-hour notice unless there was an immediate threat to life. And looking at the Sentinel, a tree that had survived the Dust Bowl and 2 world wars, I knew it hadn't decided to become a killer the exact moment my dad died. I thought I was just fighting a crazy lady over a tree, but as the sun came up over the maimed carcass of my oak, casting a weird, broken shadow across the street, I realized I was tugging on a thread that was attached to a sweater knitted entirely out of fraud, lies, and suburban corruption. Corinna Sterling had made a fatal mistake. She thought she was breaking a man who was already down, but she didn't know that my father raised me to be like that oak. You can hack at the branches, but the roots go deep, and they hold the ground long after the storm has passed. The war for Oakhaven Heights had just begun. Here is where the story takes a turn into the absurd, because when you destroy something beautiful out of spite, the universe has a funny way of making you pay for the advertising. By the next morning, the half-tree of Silver Creek wasn't just a neighborhood tragedy, it was an internet sensation. A teenager down the block had posted a TikTok of the surreal, gravity-defying sculpture Corinna had created, captioning it "Suburban Dolly." And within 24 hours, we had influencers in wide-brimmed hats posing next to the exposed heartwood, looking mournful for the gram. It was the hottest photo spot in the county. Corinna was furious. She stomped out in her bathrobe, screaming at teenagers to get off the communal easement. But every time she yelled, someone just live-streamed her meltdown, turning her into a caricature of the villain she actually was. But while the internet was laughing, I was loading my weapons. I called an old buddy of mine, Elias Vance. Elias isn't your typical strip mall lawyer. He's a corporate shark who got tired of defending chemical companies and decided to use his powers for the little guy, mostly because he hates bullies more than he likes money. When he saw the drone footage of my tree, he didn't talk about damages or property lines. He started laughing, a low, menacing rumble. "She bifurcated a heritage oak without a permit," Elias asked, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Mac, that's not a code violation. In Arizona, messing with a tree that old without an environmental impact study is practically a felony." But that's just the appetizer. Mrs. Kim had been busy, too. She'd gone full forensic accountant on the HOA newsletters and cross-referenced the contractor Corinna had used. "Look at the name on the truck in the video." Mrs. Kim pointed a manicured finger at the screen. "Sterling and Sons Landscaping." "Sterling?" I asked. "Like Corinna Sterling?" "Her brother-in-law." Mrs. Kim grinned, revealing the gold tooth she usually kept hidden. She paid him $3,800 for the emergency job. No competitive bidding. No board approval. She basically wrote a check from the neighborhood's savings account directly into her family's pocket. Elias looked like he had just tasted a fine wine. "That's embezzlement, Mac. And if she did it once, she's done it a dozen times." We started digging, and it was like peeling back the wallpaper in a haunted house. There was just more rot underneath. We found invoices for consulting fees paid to her nephew, bills for security upgrades that never happened, all authorized by Corinna under the guise of emergency powers. But Corinna sensed the walls closing in. That's when the harassment shifted from annoying to criminal. 3 days after I hired Elias, I woke up to find all 4 tires on my work truck slashed, the rubber flayed open with a box cutter. My mailbox was smashed in. Anonymous notes started appearing on my porch, typed on cheap paper, saying things like smart people know when to move and accidents happen to non-compliant residents. She even called the county on me, claiming I was running an illegal commercial enterprise because of the tourists taking photos of the tree. Mr. Thorne, the code enforcement officer said, looking exhausted as he stood in my driveway. I have a report here that you're selling tickets to view a botanical anomaly. I'm not selling anything, I said, gesturing to the crowd of hipsters taking selfies. They're here for the irony. But the real turning point, the moment the tide shifted, was when I went to the county records office to pull the original deed for my house, searching for anything that could stop her from finishing the job and cutting down the rest of the tree. I found something better than a loophole. I found a shield. The 1947 deed for Oak Haven Heights contained a grandfathered covenant, an environmental protection clause for specimen flora planted prior to the subdivision's incorporation. My great-grandfather, bless his paranoid heart, had registered the Sentinel as a landmark organism to prevent future developers from paving over it. It says here, Elias read aloud, his voice trembling with excitement, that the removal or defacement of this tree requires a federal review and the signature of the state botanist. Mac, she didn't just break HOA rules. She violated a federal preservation order. We had her. We had the embezzlement, the fraud, and the environmental crime. But we didn't just want to sue her. We wanted to end her reign of terror publicly. Corinna, oblivious to the nuke we were building, called a mandatory town hall meeting. Her agenda? To vote on the final removal of the hazard tree and to institute a special assessment fee on all residents to pay for the security concerns caused by the tourists. In other words, she wanted to charge the neighborhood to clean up her own mess and funnel more money to her brother-in-law. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile room with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. Corinna sat at the head table, flanked by her sycophant board members, looking every bit the dictator in a pastel blouse. The situation at the Thorne residence has become untenable, she announced, glaring at me. We must act decisively to restore order to Oak Haven Heights. I am calling for an immediate vote to remove the remainder of the tree. I stood up. The room went silent. Before we vote, I said, my voice steady, channeling every ounce of Pop's quiet strength. My attorney, Mr. Vance, has a few documents to distribute. Elias stood up, and with the theatrical flair of a magician, he didn't just hand out papers, he served them. He walked up to the head table and dropped a stack of legal filings thick enough to choke a horse right in front of Corinna. What is this? She hissed. That, Elias boomed, turning to face the crowd of neighbors, is a restraining order preventing the destruction of a federally protected landmark. It is also a criminal complaint filed with the district attorney for 27 counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The room erupted. It wasn't just a murmur, it was a roar. Neighbors who had been fined for the wrong shade of beige, for leaving a bike out, for breathing wrong, they all stood up. You paid your brother-in-law $3,000 to butcher that tree. Mrs. Kim shouted from the back, waving the printed bank statements. We have the receipts, Corinna. Corinna's face went through a spectrum of colors that don't exist in nature, from pale ivory to violent crimson. She banged her gavel, screaming for order, but the power had shifted. The illusion of her authority shattered like glass. This is slander, she shrieked. I am the president. I have emergency powers. You have the right to remain silent. A voice came from the back of the room. We all turned. 2 deputies and a man in a suit who looked remarkably like an FBI agent were standing in the doorway. And that's when I knew. The Sentinel might have been half gone, but Corinna Sterling was about to lose everything. You watch movies and you expect the villain to go down fighting, maybe a high-speed chase or a shootout. But in real life, true defeat looks like a woman in a wrinkled blazer trying to stuff incriminating documents into her purse while a federal agent politely asks her to put her hands behind her back. The FBI agent, a guy named Agent Miller, wasn't there for the tree. He was there because Corinna's embezzlement scheme had crossed state lines. Using the U.S. Postal Service to mail fraudulent invoices is mail fraud, and the feds don't have a sense of humor about that. As they led her out of the community center in handcuffs, the flash of cameras from the local news crew, who Mrs. Kim had tipped off, caught the exact moment her superiority complex dissolved into panic. The silence that followed her exit was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the sound of 100 people realizing they didn't have to be afraid anymore. The fallout was spectacular. Sterling and Hart, the massive law firm she tried to hire using HOA funds, dropped her the moment the check bounced. Her husband, realizing his assets were about to be frozen to pay back the community, filed for divorce faster than the ink could dry on the arrest warrant. In the months that followed, the truth came out in court. Corinna hadn't just targeted me. She was running a Ponzi scheme with the neighborhood's reserve fund. She was weeks away from bankrupting the entire association. Cutting my tree was a distraction, a way to manufacture a crisis to justify withdrawing huge sums of cash before the annual audit. She pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have humiliated her further. The judge, a stern woman who clearly loved gardening, threw the book at her. 18 months in federal prison, full restitution of the $67,000 she stole, and a lifetime ban from holding any position of trust in a nonprofit organization. But the real ending of this story isn't about her. It's about the tree. We didn't cut down the rest of the sentinel. Instead, the university's horticulture department came out and treated the wound. They sealed the cut, braced the remaining trunk, and told me that because the root system was so massive, the tree would survive. It would grow new branches, lopsided and strange, but alive. Today, Oakhaven Heights is different. We dissolved the old board and elected a new council where Mrs. Kim serves as treasurer, and let me tell you, she accounts for every single penny. We rewrote the bylaws to strip the power from the presidency. The half-tree is still there. It's become a symbol now. The tourists still come, but they don't mock it anymore. A local artist installed a beautiful stained glass panel that fits into the missing half of the tree, so when the sun hits it at the right angle, the tree looks whole again, glowing with light instead of wood. I sit under it sometimes with Jenny Kim, Mrs. Kim's granddaughter, who helped me organize the legal files during those sleepless nights. We drink coffee and watch the light filter through the glass and the leaves. I look at that scarred, battered oak, and I think about justice. We like to think justice is a system, a set of laws, a gavel banging in a quiet room. But I've learned that justice is actually a lot like gardening. You have to be patient. You have to watch for the weeds that try to choke out the good things. And sometimes, when something rot has taken hold, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty to rip it out by the roots. Corinna thought she could cut my history in half, and I would just roll over. She forgot the most basic rule of nature. When you prune a tree, you don't kill it. You just stimulate new growth. So, here is the question I want to leave you with, the thing that keeps me up at night even now. If you saw someone destroying the things that matter most to your neighbors, not just their property, but their dignity, their history, would you speak up? Or would you wait until they came for your tree? Because bullies like Corinna don't stop at the property line. They keep cutting until someone takes away the saw. I'm Mac Thorne, and this is my half-tree. It's ugly, it's broken, and it's the most beautiful thing I own. Thanks for listening.